Hey everybody, Who's Your Jedi here with another review for you. This time I'm going to be reviewing the animated film Gen 13. And if you've never heard of this film, well, I'm not going to be that surprised. I'll get into that why this is a somewhat obscure film in just a few minutes, but let me tell you a little bit about the movie before we get into it. Gen 13 is based on a comic book series by the same name that came out in originally around 1993, and throughout the mid 90s was a reasonably popular book, and that's what ended up netting it its own animated film, which was released in 1999. Now, one thing you have to understand about me is that back when this series was coming out, I was one of its biggest fans. Seriously, you go back and look through those old back issues of Gen 13, you will find about 5 or 6 different letters. Yeah, this is back in the day when comic book companies still printed letters from the fans in the books. 5 or 6 letters from me. In 1997, the Gen 13 put out a special book sort of celebrating the series, and before they did, they asked for the fans to send in photographs of themselves, which would be integrated into the book. In fact, it was even called the Gen 13 1997 Yearbook. Yeah, I'm pretty sure it was in 97. Yes, actually, I'm positive, because the reason I am positive is because the photo I sent in, it was the same photo that was used in my senior yearbook. And when Gen 13 got a spin-off series called DV8, I also got a lot of letters printed in there. And if you go and check in issue 22 of that series, the book's editor even actually took the time out to call me the series' biggest fan. So I'm not saying all of that to just do fanboy bragging, okay? I'm not doing that. I want you guys to understand that at the time this series come out, for whatever reason, it really struck a chord with me. Gen 13 and its spin-off DV8. These books, for some reason, just absolutely resonated with me like few comic books I'd read at the time, and even since. And it's not because they were the most mind-blowing, legendary comics that were coming out. That's not the case. Gen 13 was always a reasonably good book, but it certainly was no Watchmen or anything like that. But for whatever reason, something about the characters and the storytelling just really struck a chord within me. And to this day, out of all the fandoms that I've been in over the years, Gen 13 still remains one that is closest to my heart. So I was beyond thrilled when there was an animated movie announced, and I was even more thrilled when I actually got the chance to be at the world premiere of this at Comic-Con International in San Diego back in 1999. I thought I was one of the luckiest people in the world to get in to see this movie. So, with that said, let's kind of let me explain why it is you've probably never heard of this movie. And keep in mind, this is just what I have read online over the years. And, who knows for sure, but this is the story that I've most commonly heard. What happened was that this film was released on video by Buena Vista Entertainment. Now, Buena Vista is basically a sub-company of Disney. Whenever Disney wants to put out something that's beyond the family-friendly thing, whenever they want to put out something that's R-rated or whatever, they don't do it through the Disney thing, obviously. They do it through Buena Vista. The story that I've heard about this is basically that before after the movie was in production, but before it got released, some executive at Disney got the idea in their heads that Gen 13 would be a really great to make as a live-action movie, but they wanted to retool it for kids and call it, and I swear to God, this is what I have heard, they were going to call it 7th Graders. Now, the Gen 13 kids are all of college age, so yeah. And in order to make this more viable, they couldn't really do it if this animated movie came out, and that it was, and this is part of why this is a film is kind of important historically in the terms of American animation. It was not a family-friendly movie. This is a movie with really one of the very first, honestly, probably the first animated superhero movie to have a good bit of swearing, some pretty intense violence, and even a little bit of blink and you'll miss it nudity. Well, that sort of thing floating around out there in the public as the reputation for what this movie would be based on wasn't going to go over so well. So basically, any U.S. release for this movie was killed. It got some sort of backwater release in Australia, and I think aired on TV in Europe a couple of times. But basically, the executives at Buena Vista Disney scuttled the release of this movie so that it could never really get any major, even niche exposure. And then, of course, the whole Seventh Graders movie never happened. And anyway, so as I said, just because it was, and keep in mind, this is, again, something that came out in 1999. This was a movie that, at least in my opinion, took a step in the direction of some of the more mature superhero animated movies that we've seen. Now, granted, the granddaddy of all the mature superhero animation is still the Todd McFarlane Spawn animated series from a good while back. But still, I feel that the Gen 13 movie is sort of a forgotten chapter in the maturation of superhero animation in the West. That's the most academic way I can explain it to you. And because of that, that's why I want to talk about this movie. And also, of course, because again, these characters are very dear to my heart, even all of these years later. So anyway, let's talk a little bit about the basic. And I'm not going to give away the whole movie, but let me set up the basic plot here. Is basically sometime back in the day, the government assembled a team of America's best soldiers, the creme de la creme, the most badass guys from all branches of the U.S. military, and they called these guys Team 7, sent them out on all these, sort of action movie badass kicking commie butt missions. So then the government gets the idea, well, we have all these really badass soldiers. If we gave them superpowers, they'd be even more badass. So they exposed them to something that was called the Gen Factor. Now, what exactly this is never really made 100% clear, but whatever. It's some kind of crazy MacGuffin that gives these guys superpowers. The only downside is that while it does give these guys powers, the power is extremely hard to control. Some of these guys don't survive the process, and some of them can only use their powers at great physical cost. It takes an enormous toll on their body. So after having this done to them against their will, the Team 7 guys basically sort of screw the government and go rogue and sort of go underground. And as you would probably expect, they sort of get on with their lives. They get married, they have families and all this other stuff. So of course the government never stops looking for these guys, and eventually they realize that the children of these soldiers, because they were born from fathers whose genes had been altered by the Gen Factor, the superhuman abilities within them would be stable because they were born with these powers, and thus they would be more powerful. So the government sets out to hunt down these kids and capture them. Naturally, the fathers and the mothers are not too happy about this. So again, they go even further underground. Some of them are killed by the government in all of this, and some of the kids are hidden away. So anyway, the basic premise is that this all picks up about 20 years later. The government has tracked down a bunch of these kids and has brought them to a secret compound out in the middle of nowhere under the premise of being part of basically a golden ticket government internship program, and is going to try and get these kids superpowers to manifest, and from there basically take the steps into turning them into super soldiers. Okay, that is the basic idea of what's going on in these movies. Now, for this movie, several changes were made from the comics, and I'm okay with that. And I'm trying to review this movie as objectively as I can. But again, these characters are very dear to my heart, so it's hard for me to do that. And the biggest gripe that I have with this is one that, tragically, I know is necessary. The Gen 13 team did originally consist of 5 characters. In this movie, they just sort of put 2 of them off to the side and focus on 3. Now, in the comics, and I'm not going to bother with the code names because it's really not important. The Gen 13 kids were always very, very loose with the idea of code names. Anyway, so in the comics, the 5 main characters are Bobby, Sarah, Eddie, Caitlin, and Roxy. In the animated movie, Bobby is reduced to just having a cameo. He doesn't get any lines. Sarah gets like 4 or 5 lines and sort of an extended cameo, but that's it. And as much as I hate it, I understand why they do it. If you focus just on Eddie, Roxy, and Caitlin, who, to be completely fair, were the most popular characters on the team, then it's a much tighter story. And overall, actually, I'll come back to the story a little bit later. Let's talk about some of the people who were involved in making this movie. And this is part of the reason, actually, this is a lot of the reason why, when I was hearing about this movie getting made, I was so excited. Because really, you've got a lot of talented people here. For example, the director and the co-writer of the script is a guy called Kevin Altieri. And if that name sounds familiar to you, he was one of the big guys on Batman the Animated Series, a show that to this day you can very easily make the case for being the best animated superhero show ever. Now they also had quite a few talented people doing the voice work here. The character of John Lynch, sort of the mentor, a guy who ends up being the mentor to the team, is voiced by John Delancey, who of course is best known for being Q on Star Trek: The Next Generation. I've also seen the guy in person. He's actually quite a very personable, very funny gentleman. The character of Caitlin was voiced by a woman named Alicia Witt, who at the time was best known for the movie, quite a good one actually, Mr. Holland's Opus. Nowadays she's can't talk. Nowadays she's best known for being on the show Law and Order: Criminal Intent. Roxy was voiced by Elizabeth Daily, who also goes by the name of E.G. Daily. And people are going to, of course, know her as the voice of Tommy Pickles and Buttercup on Powerpuff Girls. Eddie was voiced, interestingly enough, by, of all people, but it's still an appropriate choice, actually, Flea from the band Red Hot Chili Peppers. No, seriously, he is voiced by Flea. And to be completely fair, Flea, whose real name I cannot actually recall, has actually done a decent bit of acting. If you've ever seen The Big Lebowski, which is a fantastic movie, I love The Big Lebowski, he's in that. He plays a German nihilist. We are the nihilist. We believe in nothing. God, that's such a funny movie. But anyway, yeah, he's Eddie. Lauren Lane, best known as, of all people, Cece from The Nanny, is one of the main bad guys here, Ivana Bayal. We have Cloris Leachman is in the show as well. She plays the character of Helga, who gets a significantly expanded role in the film from the comics. And Cloris Leachman, she's one of those people that's just been in TV and entertainment for just forever. Some of her more recent stuff is things like she appeared as herself a couple of times on Family Guy. According to Wikipedia, she was on Malcolm in the Middle, I think, as Malcolm's grandma. And also, according to Wikipedia, she is also the oldest person to have ever competed on Dancing with the Stars. I'm going to have to take Wikipedia's word on that. Dancing with the Stars is not my kind of show. It's my mom's kind of show. I love Mom, but she's got rotten taste in TV. Anyway. Oh, yes. Of course. I can't forget about the voice of the other major villain of the show, of this movie, whose name is Threshold, and he's none other than the man of 1,000 voices, Mark Hamill, who has just done so much voice work and also played a guy called Luke Skywalker in a couple of movies, and naturally is the most popular guy to ever do the voice of the Joker. So, again, we have a very talented director who's also co-writing the script. We've got, actors from, TV and movies, all of whom have, some pretty serious credentials under their belt. The animation itself is, well, it's from 1999, so obviously it looks kind of dated, but for the time it was pretty solid stuff, and even today there are a few scenes that look, exceptionally well done. So here's the thing that I hate to say about this movie, and that is it just doesn't quite work. There are so many good elements floating around here in this film, and they just never gel. I mean, let me tell you my overall feeling of this movie is that it's not a bad movie. It's an all right movie, but you can painfully see that if things had just gelled a little bit more, the potential to be a really great movie was there. And as someone who loves Gen 13 so much, it just breaks my heart to see that. It killed me to walk out of that movie feeling slightly disappointed. So, let's take a step back and talk about the plot briefly. I've given you the kind of the basic groundwork of what's going on, and honestly, I think the plot overall is done reasonably well. We get to spend a lot of enough time to really kind of get a good feeling for our three main characters, Caitlin, Eddie, and Roxy. Caitlin is more or less our main character, our point of view character. We spend most of the time with her. She is the character that we get to know best. And that makes perfect sense, as Caitlin was, of course, always the most popular member of Gen 13. So, in terms of that, I really don't have any problems. On the other hand, other elements like John Lynch, the guy who ultimately becomes sort of the mentor to these characters, his role is fairly small. Now, to be completely fair, he wasn't, he was a supporting character in the original storyline, but here his role just feels reduced way too much. He's basically asking these characters to the three main characters, to put an enormous amount of trust in him, even though they've only met him once and just had a fairly innocuous conversation with him, and it just doesn't really sell him as someone who is going to make such a big investment in their lives as to take up the role of mentor to these characters. Also, the character of Threshold, while never the most deeply developed character in the comics, here he's just such a by the numbers, I like doing bad things because it's fun bad guy. And even though we sort of get insight into his backstory, I really felt that they could have made him something more than he was. As I said, he really felt like a by the numbers villain. And again, as I said earlier, he wasn't the deepest character in the comics, but the film actually does take some time to sort of give us Threshold's background. We understand why he is the way he is, and they never quite take it far enough to really sell him as someone that I can take as much more than just the mustache twirling villain. The character of Ayanna, by all, well, she's never really had a huge amount of depth in the comics at all, and that's fine for her. Ivana is the character who is really meant to be the straight up bad guy. Threshold is someone I think you're meant to have some sympathy for. He is someone who, in a way, is as much a victim as he is a villain. And that, I think, is really the big failing there. They really didn't drive that part of it home. There are also some changes to the relationships between the characters from the comics and the movie. I'm not going to spoil those because those are important plot points in both the comics and the movie. Now, in terms of the characters, I've already been talking about Ivana and John Lynch and Threshold. So let's talk a little bit about Roxy, Caitlin, and Eddie. Eddie here, I think he does all right. The weird thing about Eddie is, and this is a symptom that is sort of common throughout the movie, is when we're first introduced to him, Eddie seems like he is so stupid he shouldn't be able to tie his own shoes. And as the movie kind of rolls along, he seems to ratchet up to being at least as intelligent as your average person. But before that starts happening, I just really wanted to just slam my head against my desk because it just felt like, look, Grunge was always sort of meant to be the comical, slightly dumb guy in the comics. But again, here it's just, how does this guy have the intelligence to breathe? But again, as I said, by the time the movie wraps up, he's at least evolved some common sense and a few IQ points, but there doesn't really feel like there's any reason for this. So it's just sort of feels like they sort of like, okay, we're writing this character is too dumb, we need to make him act smarter. And there's no development, there's no reason for it, it just happens. Roxy, I think, was pretty close to the way she was portrayed in the comics. I'd actually probably put her and Caitlin as being the closest to their counterparts in the comics. The only really things that I could really say is I would have appreciated it if Roxy had a role really beyond being Caitlin's friend and Eddie's girlfriend. Now, granted, she is there in a way to sort of provide Caitlin with, some emotional support. She drops some exposition, but there really doesn't feel like there's much character growth for Roxy. She feels like she's really just basically the same person she was at the start of the movie as the end, except maybe a little bit more determined, and she has superpowers. Now, as I've said earlier, this really is Caitlin's movie. It is more or less the story of her transition from, shy, mousy, computer nerd into, badass, budding superheroine. And overall, it's not the most satisfying superhero journey from ordinary person to superhero that I've ever seen, but it gets the job done. And Caitlin is presented as a likable character. She's a good person. She's determined, and she values the friends that she makes very highly. She has all the plot points, all the characteristics of someone who could be a truly great superhero. And we do get to observe her journey. And when it gets to the point where she really does start to take control, starts to fight back against the forces against her, it is very satisfying to see her doing these things. But that said, I really can't actually put my finger on a specific thing. I can't really find a moment or a choice that they make where I can say this is where they went wrong. All I can really say is it's not enough. And I really wish I could articulate that better. It's just, I think this could have been done better. Honestly, I really don't think I can add too much more to that. So, let's see, what else? As I said, they did give Helga a little bit more of a role than she had in the comics, and she's there to, kind of give Caitlin someone to play off of, and to, kind of show us that all the people that are, on the government side of this are not necessarily bad, but honestly, it just ultimately feels like too little too late. And Helga's reactions to some of the things that are going on just seem to contradict each other at times. Not to spoil just to trying to throw out a little spoiler there for you. For 1 minute, she's trying to kill Caitlin, and then the next, she's telling Caitlin that she's very proud of her in a way that just doesn't really ring emotionally true, and two, just feels really, really cliche. So, let's see what else. Other than that, the only really major complaint that I can specify about the technical aspects of the movie is that the music is extraordinarily forgettable. In a good movie or a TV show, the music can do so very much to enhance a scene, and here it's just there. It doesn't really do anything. It doesn't get me excited. It doesn't make me feel anything. It's just there. So, I think I've said all I really have to say about this movie. So let's wrap this up. Overall, is this movie worth your time? Well, if you like superheroes, if you like superhero animation, then I think this movie is worth an hour and a half of your time. Just because, as I said, I think it's a forgotten milestone in superhero animation here in the West. And while it is a flawed movie, it does still present a lot of the positives, a lot of the things that I loved about Gen 13. Maybe they aren't there quite the way I would want them to be, or quite as strongly as I would want them to be, but a lot of the time they are there. I think this could be something that, if you find yourself liking it, or at least thinking, yeah, that's decent enough, well, then, you know what, go out and give the actual Gen 13 and DV8 comics a try. You might like them. I certainly, still to this day, love them a lot. As I've said more many times, they hold a very special place in my heart. Now, the problem, of course, is that the release for this movie was buried by the good folks at Disney. So I have found a place online that is currently hosting the movie. I will throw that link up in the description. So, hey, if you've got some time, go and check it out. And definitely, if you want some superhero comics that are a little bit more lighthearted, a little bit more on the fun side, definitely give those old Gen 13 issues a try. Anyway, folks, that's all I have for you this time. Until next time, please comment, rate, and subscribe. You can, of course, follow me on Twitter at Hoosier Jedi. And until next time, take care and have a good one.